The following is an ESG Video Blog.
Hi, I'm Jason Buffington. I'm the Senior Analyst at ESG covering data protection. One of the more fun debates in data protection storage is disk, dedupe or simple, or tape, or cloud. Let's table the question of whether dedupe should be done in an appliance, physical or virtual, or within the backup software, but just talk about the media: disk, tape, cloud. Cloud is actually not a media. It's a delivery mechanism with a different economic model. Cloud storage providers use disk for sure, and a few are also offering nearline solutions, some of which are based on, wait for it, tape. If we suspend that entire tangent argument on cloud isn't really a medium type, but a delivery model, then we can go back to the question, which medium types are people using in data backup? Let's look at the data from ESG's Data Protection Modernization Trends, where we asked about disk, tape, cloud, and every combination in between. The most common scenario continues to be what I call the gold standard of disk to tape. D to D to T, where you back up from primary disk, production, to secondary disk for efficient dedupe, fast and granular recovery, etc., and then to tertiary tapes for long-term retention. About 1 in 4 organizations do D to T today. In second place is a variable tie around 16 to 17% each, with a very interesting contrast. 16% of organizations are using the newer gold standard of disk to cloud, D to C. Same rapid granular recovery to disk and then to cloud for tertiary retention. In my mind, the trade-off here is around regulatory compliance as to how long the tertiary retention is on cloud versus tape and scale. Because how much data you have to retain for a long period will, or should, affect your cloud versus tape discussion in long-term retention. Maybe that's why the other contender for second place at 17% of orgs is disk to tape, meaning that tape is used for on-prem recovery and then some tapes go off-prem for retention, BCDR preparedness, etc. And that's kind of funky if you think about it. The second most common method of data protection in use today is an all-tape solution. Coming in as a third band of choices are the all-disk options. Disk to disk for fast on-prem protection but no tertiary or off-prem retention, 14% of orgs. Disk to disk across a WAN to presumably a third disk. So it's an all-disk everywhere solution, 11%. And disk straight across a WAN to another disk, like for centralized backups of branch or remote offices back at headquarters, that's 6% of orgs. Disk to tape, old school, regular tape backups, also 6% of orgs. And bringing up the rear, for today at least, disk to cloud, 4%. I could make a case for almost every one of these solutions, and that's my point. Your recovery goals and your retention requirements and your economic considerations should all come into play here. Me personally, I love cloud backups for remote offices, though depending on your recovery needs, I could see bringing the data back to headquarters if that's who's going to use the data during a crisis. I cannot say enough goodness about cloud protection for endpoint devices. Just do it. But ensure that you have IT oversight and you're not using a consumer backup as a service. And I think the cloud is very compelling in a BCDR solution where you're not only using cloud-based storage, but also cloud-based compute in order to fail over. Said another way, why BAS when you can DRAS? I'm a fan of cloud-based services and data protection. I'm also a fan of tape, especially if you're in an industry that requires retention. Or if you're storing data for regulatory or operational purposes for greater than 2 years. And by the way, any way that you look at it, disk ought to be the primary means of protection and recovery before you go to whichever tape or cloud or tertiary disk that you might eventually retain data in. Because it is really hard, if not impossible, to reliably meet today's SLAs without a fast on-prem copy of data to recover from. If we add up the different combinations in the research, the data tells a similar story. 73% of organizations use disk as their first tier of recovery, and I would expect that number to gently continue to rise in the future. 69% of organizations use something other than disk in their overall strategy. 49%, nearly half, are using tape, where 20% are using cloud. 23% of organizations exclusively use tape, nearly 1 in 4. 4% exclusively use cloud today. Do I expect the tape number will recede some and the cloud number will rise? Maybe, but not as much as you might think. In the case of tape's decline, yeah, I expect that some of those that are using tape exclusively will evolve to a disk plus tape model for more efficiency and for tightening SLAs. But it's those same goals, efficiency and SLAs, are what will likely keep pure straight to cloud solutions relatively low. I could do a whole nother podcast on D to D to C and the myriad ways to mix those parts between backup as a service architectures, hybrid infrastructure architectures, and cloud storage augmenting on-prem backups. But that's for a different day. In the meantime, disk and tape and cloud each have their place around rapid recovery, reliable retention, and data survivability and agility, respectively. So if those are your goals, then arguably all three media should be part of your strategy for one scenario or another.